This video talk will be about the judicial branch of Ohio government. And I think probably will be the hardest for you to understand. It's got a lot of legal words and nuances that you might have heard a little bit of from time to time. But again, this is just going to be a real brief overview. Hopefully, you'll learn more about this in college, and maybe those of you who go on to be lawyers or in law enforcement, you'll know a lot more about it. But again, everything that I'm going to be talking about that you'll be seeing in this video comes from the Constitution of Ohio. So you've learned that there's been actually a couple constitutions. The latest big revisions were in 1912. But the main constitution that we go by in the state of Ohio was the one written in 1851. And so again, Ohio Constitution can be changed from time to time. It just hasn't been changed a great deal in over 100 years. But from time to time, there'll be a chance for voters in Ohio to make some changes with its court system. So you've seen this chart before. This one will be, this talk will be over the judicial branch. And you can see by this chart that there are several courts that fall within this system. We're talking about Ohio now, so everything that we've talked about with the federal system, that is kind of operating alongside the Ohio court system. One big difference is every judge in the federal system will be appointed by the president for a lifetime. Ohio's system, all voters will pick judges. Or I should say all judges are picked by the voters is probably a better way of saying that. General rule for judges in Ohio would be voted on for a 6-year term, and they must be a lawyer for about 6 years as well, so 6 and 6. So the general rule by the law in Ohio is you've been an attorney for 6 years, and then you're voted on for a 6-year term. So you can see from this chart we have the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, Common Pleas, Court of Claims, municipal or city courts. It's maybe easier to look at this chart, which shows you the judicial structure of the state. So at the very top are the judges who make up the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, again, there are 7 justices, but they have a 6-year term, and they're voted on by the people of Ohio. So unlike the U.S. Supreme Court, which are appointed by the president and there for a lifetime, the state Supreme Court are voted on for a certain amount of time. They have to have some judicial experience, right? They have to have been a lawyer for a while. Whereas the U.S. Supreme Court, there are no requirements listed in the U.S. Constitution about requirements. You don't have to be a judge. You can be a plumber, assuming that the president thinks you're qualified and the United States Senate agrees, then you're on the U.S. Supreme Court. That's not how it works for Ohio. You have to have some legal experience and you're voted on. And generally, they are at the top of the pyramid. So usually, if they are hearing a case, it's been appealed up through the structure you see on the screen now. They do have some original jurisdiction. It depends on the case, but any case dealing with the death penalty, if there's an appeal, goes to the Supreme Court, and generally everyone appeals. Nobody goes to the death penalty willingly. So anytime there's a death penalty case, the Supreme Court looks it over. Anytime there's a question about Ohio's Constitution, or if a law is passed and it might conflict with Ohio's Constitution or the U.S. Constitution, Ohio's Supreme Court gets involved. So if you were to look at the Ohio Supreme Court, 7 members, all voted on by the people of Ohio. And one of those 7 would be considered the Chief Justice of Ohio's Supreme Court. Now, below them would be the Court of Appeals. And I think it goes without saying, though, the Supreme Court has the final say on all matters Ohio and Ohio law. And they are the court of last resort. But beneath them are the Court of Appeals, and there are 12 districts around the state. And all of these judges are also elected. And you guessed it, 6 and 6. So they have to have about 6 years of experience. And once they are elected, they are on the court for 6 years. And all of these judges really are elected without official party affiliation. But, I think voters can figure out based on past decisions or just what the judges have said as they run for election, what party they would probably fall in. But generally, we try not to assign party affiliation with many of these judges. So the Court of Appeals is kind of that step. If you don't agree with what happens to you, you have to go through them typically before you get to the Supreme Court. But most of everyone's legal connections or legal, I would say, I guess, just connection with the court or any type of Ohio law will probably fall within the Court of Common Pleas. And one thing we have to know, and it's really fundamental in understanding Ohio and how we do things legally in the law system, is it's really based on the county. So there are 88 counties in Ohio, and every county has got a common plea court. So I know it seems weird to use the word common pleas. It's basically like you plead before a court. It comes from the British system, and this basically was any kind of complaint that you had against another person or the people had against you that didn't involve the king. So common plea is a court that's found in all of our 88 counties. So whether we're talking Franklin County or Hamilton County or Ottawa County, every county has a common plea court. And within that common plea court, there are basically 4 divisions. There's the General Division. That's the one that will typically make all the headlines. That'll be major crimes. And again, these major crimes like murder or any kind of felony, which we'll talk about felonies in a moment, generally fall within the General Division of the Common Plea Court. And it's that one that usually is on the news. But there are also other parts of the Common Plea Court, like juvenile, if you're under 18 and you do something wrong, that's a special judge in a court that will hear you. Probate is if someone were to pass away and die and they don't really have a will, and there's some people who are in their family who want the property, we'll go to that. And then domestic relations would be divorce, marriage, and anything dealing with child custody, adoption. But for the most part, if you're watching the news and you're seeing criminals or people who are charged with a crime, they're going to be going to the county common pleas court. And generally, to go there, it would be what we would call felony. So hopefully you never have any experience with a felony. But at the Franklin County, for example, the Columbus County, there will be a common pleas court with a common pleas judge. And it's in that courtroom that you will be charged with a felony. So a felony is typically a violent crime, usually involves a longer punishment, more than a year or perhaps even a death penalty. And sometimes common pleas courts can hear civil disputes. Remember, when we hear the word civil, that means it's just usually about money. No one's really going to go to jail. But it typically would be a lot of money, so $15,000 or up. But again, every county can kind of do it a little differently. But typically, common pleas, the General Division will hear felony cases and civil disputes that involve a lot of money. Now, this is where it gets a little more complicated. So if something bad happens that involves the criminal side of the court system, so someone's accused of a crime, it generally goes like this. The first to decide whether or not someone has committed a crime would be the law enforcement of that county. So, for example, using Franklin County, the Franklin County Sheriff's Office would decide. So the sheriff or his or her deputies would be the first to respond, and they would say, yeah, we think in our opinion, this person has committed a crime, broken a law, a state law, a city law. Now, where it gets complicated is also in Franklin County would be cities. So the big one would be Columbus. So those officers would first to respond when someone calls for help. and they would decide whether or not the person did something wrong, and they make that decision whether to place them under arrest. Of course, these officers and deputies, whether we're talking Franklin County or Columbus, Ohio, or some of the smaller towns in Franklin County, they are trained to know a certain level of the law. Okay, but they're mostly trained on how to make a decision whether or not they think, based on their knowledge of the law, a person has committed a crime. Once they make that decision and a person is arrested, then it is turned over to the prosecuting attorney. And by the way, the sheriff is an elected position. So sheriff is an elected position in the county, whereas the chief of police typically in the city of Columbus and other small towns are not. So a lot of the burden of kind of that first level falls on the sheriff, which is also another British word meaning from the shire, right? The shire would be the person who would be in charge of that chunk of land in England, and in our chunks in Ohio are called counties. So the sheriff would make the decision, and then they put that person in a jail. The sheriff runs a county jail. In Franklin County, where Columbus is, there are 2 jails. Some counties may only have 1. Some small rural counties may share a jail with 2 or 3 other counties. But in Franklin County, it's big enough for enough people that they actually have to have 2 jails. So the sheriff who's elected runs those 2 jails, and that's where people who are charged are housed until there can be a decision made by the second level, which would be the prosecuting attorney, who's more skilled at the law. And again, the prosecuting attorney is voted on by the voters of the county. They're the second to decide, and they weigh all the evidence, and they would then use a grand jury really to decide if there's going to be a trial. So the prosecuting attorney relies on a grand jury of citizens that they call in to help make this decision whether or not there's enough to go to a trial. The final decision on whether a person is guilty or not, assuming that the grand jury decides there's enough evidence to take it to trial, would be the petit jury. And this is that jury of about 12 people who would then decide whether or not someone is guilty. They are the final decision on guilt. And once they make the decision, if they decide someone is guilty, then it's the judge who is also elected in the county, the common pleas judge, who would decide the punishment. He or she can't just pick any punishment. They base their punishments on state law. So if Ohio has, for example, the death penalty, and it's a very serious capital crime, felony, then the common pleas judge could enforce or hand out the death penalty. Around Ohio, we have a variety of prisons that are run by the state for felons. And this is typically where the most violent and the worst of people are put if they've been convicted of a crime. Now, again, there are other parts of the common pleas court, like domestic relations, juvenile division, probate. These are not really typically criminal. They are more about just dealing with things that life brings, death without knowing where property will go, children who make bad choices, but yet those choices have affected other people, broken the law, and then domestic, when families are coming together, breaking apart, kids are being adopted, all of that falls within that. There are some other county and municipal courts around the state. These are called municipal courts, but typically these are for less serious crimes, typically misdemeanors. So a lot of cities will have city courts or municipal courts, and they will deal with things that are not at the felony level. So perhaps trespassing or simple assault or petty theft might be a misdemeanor that would fall into a city court. But if it's a major deal, it will go to a common pleas court. And we do have occasionally mayor's courts, but they're very rare. Only 2 states have mayor's courts today, Ohio and Louisiana. They're very rarely used in small little towns. And the court of claims would be any court against a judgment or filing a suit against the state of Ohio. And here is what you might see as a municipal jail. Just every city has one, but they're typically not hardcore prisons.